The blizzard arrived before sunset, swallowing the Montana frontier beneath a wall of white. Daniel Cole had been riding home from town when his horse suddenly stopped. Through the snow, he heard something faint beneath the howling wind, a cry that sounded almost human. Daniel climbed down, pulled his coat tighter, and searched the frozen trail. Near a cluster of rocks, he discovered an Apache woman curled around a tiny baby. Both were covered in snow, barely moving, and dangerously close to freezing. Daniel immediately understood that leaving them there meant death. The woman tried to protect the child when he approached, even though she was too weak to stand. Daniel slowly removed his gloves and showed her his empty hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "Your baby needs warmth." The woman watched him through exhausted eyes, then finally loosened her arms enough for him to see the infant. The baby was silent, frighteningly still, while the mother trembled uncontrollably. Daniel had spent years hearing stories about Apache war parties and frontier conflicts. He had also learned that stories told in saloons rarely showed the whole truth. What stood before him was not an enemy. It was a mother desperately trying to keep her child alive. Daniel wrapped his heavy wool coat around both of them, but the cold had already taken too much strength from their bodies. He lifted the baby first, pressing the infant carefully against his chest beneath his shirt and coat. Then he helped the mother stand. She immediately collapsed. Daniel caught her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, her body weakened by hunger, cold, and exhaustion. He looked toward the distant mountains, knowing his cabin was still miles away. His horse could carry one person safely, but not three in such conditions. Daniel made a decision. He would walk. He tied the reins around his wrist and carried the baby close to his heart. With his other arm supporting the mother, he started through the storm. The snow reached his boots, then his ankles, while the wind pushed against him hard enough to make every step painful. The Apache woman struggled to remain upright, but Daniel refused to let her fall. "Keep moving," he told her. "Just a little farther." She spoke something in her language. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he understood the fear in her voice. "I know," he answered. "I know you're scared." The baby suddenly made a tiny sound. Daniel looked down. The infant was alive. He felt a rush of relief. "That's it," he whispered. "Stay with me." The mother heard the sound too. Her eyes filled with tears. She reached toward the baby, but Daniel kept the infant protected from the wind. "Your child is safe." The woman stared at him for several seconds before slowly nodding. They continued. The storm grew worse as night fell. Daniel's beard became coated with ice, and his fingers began losing feeling despite the gloves. His horse struggled behind them, its breath rising like smoke. Daniel knew he couldn't stop for long. If they stopped, all three could freeze. Eventually, the mother stumbled again. Daniel caught her. She tried to push away, perhaps embarrassed by her weakness. "Don't waste your strength," Daniel said. "You need it." He lifted her into his arms. The woman protested softly. Daniel shook his head. "I'm carrying you." She looked into his eyes, then stopped resisting. For the next hour, Daniel carried both the mother and baby as best he could, switching the infant between his chest and the folds of his coat. His shoulders burned. His legs trembled. Several times he nearly fell, but each time he forced himself upright. He thought about his cabin, the fire, the blankets, the dry wood stacked beside the hearth. Those thoughts became his only reason to keep walking. At last, a faint yellow light appeared through the snow. Daniel almost couldn't believe it. His cabin. He pulled the reins and guided his horse toward the door. Then he carried the mother inside, placed her near the fireplace, and immediately began warming the room. The Apache woman was unconscious. Daniel placed the baby beside her and wrapped both in blankets. He added wood to the fire until flames rose high enough to fill the cabin with warmth. Then he began working. He warmed water, prepared broth, and rubbed the mother's hands gently to restore circulation. He checked the baby's breathing repeatedly. The infant was weak but alive. Daniel didn't sleep. Every time the fire dropped, he added wood. Every time the baby moved, he checked its breathing. Every time the mother stirred, he gave her water. Near dawn, the mother opened her eyes. Daniel was sitting beside the fire. She looked toward her baby. The infant was sleeping peacefully. The woman's expression changed. Relief. Then gratitude. Then something Daniel could not identify. She whispered a few words. Daniel shook his head. "I don't understand." She touched her chest, and then pointed toward him. Daniel smiled faintly. "You're welcome." She shook her head. Again she pointed toward him, then toward the baby. Daniel realized she was trying to tell him something more important than thank you. But before he could understand, exhaustion took her back into sleep. The next morning, the storm had finally weakened. Daniel stepped outside to feed his horse. The world was covered in white, the trees heavy with snow. He had barely finished checking the animal when he heard something in the distance. At first, he thought it was thunder. Then he heard horses. Many horses. Daniel immediately reached for the rifle near the barn door. Riders appeared through the morning mist. They came slowly over the ridge, silhouettes against the pale sky. There were several of them, moving in a careful line. Daniel's heart tightened. He knew who they were. The Apache woman's people had found them. Daniel stood outside his cabin, rifle lowered but ready. He didn't know whether they had come to attack or retrieve their family. The riders stopped several yards away. One man dismounted. He was older, wearing a heavy blanket and carrying a rifle. He looked at Daniel for a long moment before speaking. Daniel couldn't understand the words. Then the Apache woman stepped outside. She was weak, but she was walking. Her baby was wrapped securely against her chest. The older man saw them. His expression changed completely. He rushed toward the mother. Daniel stepped aside. The reunion was emotional. The woman held her baby while several members of the group surrounded her. Some touched the infant's blanket, apparently making certain the child was alive. Then the older man turned toward Daniel. For several moments, neither moved. Finally, the man walked forward. Daniel expected anger. Instead, the man lowered his head. It was a gesture of respect. Daniel lowered his own head in return. The man placed one hand against his chest and spoke. The Apache woman translated as best she could. "He says you carried his daughter and her baby through the storm." Daniel shook his head. "I just did what anyone should." The woman looked at him. Her expression suggested she disagreed. The older man removed a small carved pendant from around his neck. He held it toward Daniel. Daniel hesitated. He didn't want payment, but the older man insisted. Daniel accepted it. Then something unexpected happened. The riders began dismounting. One after another, they approached Daniel. They weren't preparing to fight. They were showing respect. The woman stood beside her people and looked at Daniel with tears in her eyes. "You saved my baby," she said quietly. Daniel looked at the infant. "Your baby saved me too." She seemed confused. Daniel smiled. "I almost gave up in that storm." He looked toward the mountains. "But carrying your child gave me a reason to keep walking." The woman's eyes softened. Before leaving, she told Daniel that he would never be forgotten by her people. Daniel didn't understand what that meant until the following spring. His ranch had been struggling with thieves and cattle rustlers. Several valuable horses had disappeared, and Daniel had begun wondering whether he could continue alone. Then one morning, he found fresh tracks near his pasture. Not the tracks of thieves. Horse tracks. He followed them to the ridge and stopped. Several Apache riders stood there. They had come to warn him that a group of rustlers was moving toward his land. Daniel looked at them in disbelief. The older man pointed toward the valley. They would help him protect his ranch. Daniel smiled. He understood then. The family had not forgotten him. The tribe had not forgotten him. The kindness he had shown during the worst night of their lives had crossed the boundary between strangers. Daniel had carried a freezing mother and baby through a blizzard because he believed it was simply the right thing to do. At dawn, their people had ridden for him. And years later, Daniel would still say that the greatest reward was never the pendant, the protection, or the friendship. It was knowing that on one terrible night in the Montana wilderness, 3 lives had survived because one person refused to walk away.